The battlefield in Ukraine is changing with every passing day, and much of this is due to the US general election's impact. As we delve into the current state of conflict in Ukraine, we find that the situation is far from stagnant. Russian forces have been making significant gains, particularly near the frontline town of Avdiivka. NATO officials have sounded the alarm, highlighting the severity of the situation on the ground. The role of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in this conflict is crucial. The organization's Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, has expressed concern over the delay in Congress's approval of a $60 billion military aid package for Ukraine. Stoltenberg emphasized the importance of this aid, stating that the US's indecision has already had consequences and is impacting the flow of support to Ukraine. The lack of support from the US, a major ally, has led to an increased contribution from other NATO members. Canada and several European nations have stepped up their game to compensate for the lack of US aid. However, as Stoltenberg points out, the reality remains that the US is by far the biggest ally, and its continued support is vital for Kiev. Meanwhile, in Washington, National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby offered a stark warning about the embattled Ukraine-held town of Avdiivka. He stated that Avdiivka is at risk of falling into Russian control, largely due to Ukrainian forces running out of artillery ammunition. This shortage of resources paints a dire picture of the situation in Ukraine. The crisis in Avdiivka is a stark reminder of the challenges faced by Ukraine. Tactical withdrawals are being made, and elite fighting units are being deployed to defend the front. The situation is described as hell by the 3rd Assault Brigade, further emphasizing the dire circumstances. The stakes are high, and the world watches as the situation in Ukraine continues to unfold. The US general election's impact, the role of NATO, and the advancements by Russian forces are all crucial elements in understanding the current situation in Ukraine. As the conflict rages on, one thing is clear: the battlefield in Ukraine is transforming daily, and the world continues to watch with bated breath. As the US general election concluded, its effects have already started to ripple across the globe, particularly in Ukraine. The election's outcome has significantly influenced the United States' position on the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, casting a shadow over the future of this beleaguered Eastern European nation. One of the most notable impacts of the election is the failure to pass a significant military aid package for Ukraine. This $60 billion package, stalled in the legislative process, was intended to bolster Ukraine's defenses against Russian aggression. However, the package's stagnation has left Ukraine in a precarious position. NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has warned that this delay is already having consequences on the battlefield. Stoltenberg expressed his belief that Congress would eventually approve the aid package, but his cautious optimism doesn't negate the fact that Russia is making significant gains near the frontline town of Avdiivka. The failure to pass this vital package has disrupted the flow of support to Ukraine, leaving them vulnerable. While other allies like Canada and European nations have increased their support to compensate, the reality remains that the United States is by far the biggest ally. Their continued support is vital for Ukraine's resistance against Russia's advances. The US's failure to pass the aid package is tied to internal politics. The Senate passed a foreign aid package, but the House Speaker, a supporter of former President Trump, has refused to allow a vote on it without added measures to tackle migration across the US-Mexico border. This political stalemate has had real-world consequences for Ukraine, illustrating how the outcomes of the US general election can have far-reaching effects. The US general election's effects are far-reaching, and Ukraine is feeling the impact. As the political landscape in America shifts, the world watches and waits, hoping for a resolution that will bring aid and support to those who need it most. As the situation in Ukraine worsens, NATO's Secretary General has expressed concerns about the lack of US support. A tense battlefield scenario unfolds in Ukraine, with the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg warning about the repercussions of delayed US military aid. Stoltenberg still holds hope for Congress to greenlight the $60 billion package, which currently stands in a state of stagnation. But as the clock ticks, NATO officials report Russia making significant inroads, particularly around the frontline town of Avdiivka. Stoltenberg, in his Brussels address, stated, "The fact that the US has not been able to make a decision so far has already had consequences. It is impacting the flow of support." Interestingly though, this void is being partially filled by other allies. While Canada and several European nations are stepping up their contributions to NATO, there's no denying the reality that the US remains the biggest ally. The importance of their continued support to Kyiv is paramount. This comes after the Senate passed a foreign aid package earlier this week, including $60 billion for Ukraine, $14 billion for Israel, and funds for other allies. However, the package has hit a roadblock, with the House Speaker Mike Johnson refusing to let it pass without added measures to tackle migration across the US-Mexico border. John Kirby, a National Security Council spokesperson, painted a grim picture of Avdiivka's fate. He stated, "Avdiivka is at risk of falling into Russian control. In very large part, this is happening because Ukrainian forces on the ground are running out of artillery ammunition, with Ukrainian land units rationing artillery shells and Russia making significant advances around Avdiivka. The conflict is reaching a critical juncture. Medium and long-range defense systems designed to protect large cities and crucial infrastructure from attacks are being used up at an alarming rate. The lack of US support is a cause for concern for NATO as the conflict in Ukraine escalates. The current scenario begs the question, what will be the fate of Ukraine in the absence of substantial long-term backing? The town of Avdiivka, a front line since 2014, is now at risk of falling into Russian control. This comes as a stark warning from Washington's National Security Council spokesperson. He highlighted that Ukrainian forces on the ground are running out of artillery ammunition, a critical resource for the defense of this embattled town. What's more, NATO officials have expressed grave concern about the situation in Avdiivka. They've noted that Russia has made significant gains around the town, taking advantage of the dwindling resources of the Ukrainian forces. One official at the NATO summit revealed that Ukraine's land units are rationing their use of artillery shells. This is a dire situation that has forced the Ukrainian forces to make some tactical withdrawals in Avdiivka. In response to this escalating situation, Ukraine has deployed an elite fighting unit, the 3rd Assault Brigade, to defend the front. A telegram post from the brigade painted a grim picture of the battlefield, describing it as hell. At the time of deployment, the front line was said to be extremely critical, with 7 Russian brigades ranged against them. However, 2 of those brigades had already suffered serious losses, offering a glimmer of hope amidst the bleak scenario. These developments underline the crucial role of military aid in this conflict. The US, being the largest supplier of military aid, has significantly contributed to Ukraine's defense with $44.9 billion worth of equipment. However, Pentagon officials admitted that they can no longer provide weapons or ammunition to Ukraine due to depleted budgets. This leaves a gaping hole in Ukraine's defense, one that Russia seems ready to exploit. As the battle for Avdiivka rages on, it becomes increasingly clear that Ukraine's ability to resist Russian advances is critically dependent on external support. The shortage of resources on the ground, coupled with the dwindling military aid, has created a challenging situation for Ukraine. The battle for Avdiivka is a grim example of the challenges faced by Ukraine in this conflict. Ukraine's forces are running on fumes with their resources dwindling rapidly. The situation is dire as the Ukrainian military grapples with a severe shortage of essential supplies. With the conflict escalating, their resources are being stretched to their limits and beyond. Artillery shells, a crucial component of Ukraine's defense strategy, are being rationed. The nation's land units are being forced to limit their usage, a move that has serious implications on their ability to hold the front line. This rationing is not a choice but a necessity, a stark testament to the dire situation they find themselves in. The expenditure of defense systems, particularly those of medium and long range, is also a cause for concern. These systems, which are crucial for protecting major cities and critical infrastructure, are being used up at an alarming rate. Ukrainian officials have voiced their worries about this, underscoring the gravity of the situation. The Russians, on the other hand, are fully aware of this. They understand that the Ukrainians are concerned about their rapidly depleting resources, and they are using this knowledge to their advantage. This imbalance of resources is shifting the dynamics of the conflict, giving the Russians an upper hand. For the Ukrainians, the situation in Avdiivka is particularly critical. The town, which has been on the front line since 2014, is at risk of falling into Russian control. The Ukrainian forces, already stretched thin and running low on supplies, are finding it increasingly difficult to hold their ground. Tactical withdrawals are being made in Avdiivka, a move that highlights the desperate situation the Ukrainians are in. Even elite fighting units such as the 3rd Assault Brigade are being thrown into battle to defend the front. The battlefield, as described by the brigade, is nothing short of hell. The dwindling resources are a critical concern for Ukraine as they face an emboldened adversary. With their resources running out and their enemy gaining ground, the Ukrainians are in a precarious situation. Their ability to hold the line and continue the fight is being severely tested, and the outcome of this conflict hangs in the balance. While the US support falters, other allies are stepping up to aid Ukraine in this conflict. Canada and many European nations, for example, are taking a more active role in offering support. They are bolstering their contributions to NATO, a crucial alliance that plays a significant role in the ongoing conflict. As the situation in Ukraine intensifies, the increased aid from these nations is proving to be a lifeline. Let's delve a bit deeper into the role of these allies. Canada and European nations are not just minor players in this conflict. They are providing substantial financial aid, military equipment, and training to Ukraine. This support is crucial in strengthening Ukraine's defense and resilience against the Russian advances. In addition to the direct aid, these allies are also exerting diplomatic pressure on Russia. They are leveraging international forums and bilateral dialogues to advocate for Ukraine and condemn Russia's aggression. This diplomatic support is as important as the military aid, as it helps to isolate Russia and expose its actions to global scrutiny. These allies are also providing humanitarian assistance to the Ukrainian people. The conflict has caused a significant humanitarian crisis, with thousands displaced and many more in need of aid. From food to medical supplies, these nations are providing essential support to alleviate the suffering of the Ukrainian people. However, the reality remains that the US is, by far, the biggest ally. Its support is vital for Ukraine. While the other allies can compensate to some extent, the absence of US support is keenly felt on the battlefield. The US's inaction is impacting the flow of support and is having real consequences on the ground. In conclusion, the role of Canada and the European nations is significant and commendable. Their support is helping Ukraine withstand the Russian aggression, but they cannot do it alone. The support from other allies is crucial for Ukraine as it faces this escalating conflict. The UK's Defense Secretary has made a poignant remark, calling for long-term support for Ukraine. In a world where conflicts seem to flare up and fade with the changing of the wind, the Secretary's words ring a bell, reminding us of the importance of persistence. The UK's Defense Secretary Grant Shapps has been vocal about the need for the Western world to stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine. He stresses that the fight against Russian forces on Ukrainian soil is not a sprint, but rather a marathon. His statement underscores the belief that Ukraine can only push back the Russian forces with substantial long-term backing. The Secretary is calling on the Western world, appealing to their sense of justice, their commitment to democracy, and their shared history of standing against tyrants. Fundamentally, there's a decision for the Western civilized world to make, Shapps says. And indeed, it's a decision that cannot be made lightly. It's a decision that will shape the course of history, not just for Ukraine, but for the world at large. His question is as simple as it is profound. Are we going to allow it to be the case that if you just persist for long enough and you're a tyrant, an autocrat, everyone else just gets bored? Or are we prepared to carry on supporting? Shapps' words bring into sharp focus the fact that the fight in Ukraine is not just about one country's sovereignty. It's a fight against tyranny, against autocracy, against the idea that might makes right. It's a fight that calls for continued, unwavering support from the Western world. The UK's Defense Secretary's call to arms, so to speak, is a reminder that this isn't a conflict that can be resolved with a quick fix. It's a long-term commitment, a pledge to stand with Ukraine as it fights for its sovereignty, for its right to exist as a free, independent nation. The call for long-term support raises a critical question for the Western world as they navigate this conflict. The conflict in Ukraine is a complex web of international politics, strategic interests, and humanitarian concerns. The state of affairs in Ukraine is currently precarious, with Russia making significant advancements, particularly near the frontline town of Avdiivka. The recent US general election has had a considerable impact on the unfolding situation. The stalled $60 billion military aid package meant for Ukraine has had direct repercussions on the battlefield. This delay in decision-making has already started to affect the flow of support, as noted by NATO's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg. While other allies like Canada and European nations have stepped up their support, the reality remains that the United States is by far the most significant ally. Its continued support is vital for Ukraine's defense. This is especially crucial considering the dire situation in Avdiivka, where Ukrainian forces are running out of artillery ammunition, putting the town at risk of falling into Russian control. Ukrainian forces have been forced to ration their use of artillery shells, indicating the dire need for the proposed military aid. The Ukrainians are also concerned about the rate at which their medium and long-range defense systems are being expended. This crisis has underscored the need for substantial long-term support from the Western world. The UK's Defense Secretary Grant Shapps has called on the international community to decide whether they will allow tyranny to persist, or if they will continue to provide the much-needed support to Ukraine. In conclusion, the conflict in Ukraine is a multifaceted issue with far-reaching implications. The outcome of the US general election has already begun to influence the dynamics of this conflict. As the situation continues to escalate, the response and support from the international community will play a crucial role in determining the future of Ukraine. As the conflict in Ukraine continues to escalate, the role of international allies will be crucial in determining the outcome.